Welcome to the Beau Show, the home of faith, family, and freedom. You all know that I sing and that I am very patriotic. Though our country has its flaws, there are far more things to celebrate than to be ashamed of. I think because I've sung the national anthem at many different sporting events, holidays, and veterans events, I have a particular fondness for the Star-Spangled Banner. I believe in what it represents and those who sacrificed so that we could have the freedom that we do today. For that reason, I lamented whenever I saw an athlete kneel or stay absent for the anthem. This started, of course, with the kneeling of former San Francisco 49ers second-string quarterback Colin Kaepernick, who only started to kneel during the anthem after he was benched. He said it was to protest police brutality, but since that time, it just appears that he hates everything white, even the parents who raised him. He somehow bought into the notion that white supremacy is rampant, and the only qualification to be a police officer is a commitment to target, injure, and/or kill a black person, and especially violate their rights. This was the start of the Black Lives Matter movement, which was really more of a fundraising operation than it was an awareness campaign. Its founders had unabashed Marxist roots and funded lavish lifestyles rather than changed the systems they protested against. In 2020, in the middle of the pandemic and social distancing, it seemed that violence and protest were permitted as long as it was politically correct. So while people were forbidden from making a living due to COVID restrictions, BLM protesters were permitted to get together to loot and light things on fire. Go figure as to how that flattened the curve. It seemed that protesters were given a lot of slack. One of the athletes that protested the national anthem, in addition to Kaepernick, was WNBA player Brittney Griner. I don't follow the WNBA, and not many people do, but Griner stated in 2020 that the national anthem should not even be played at games. So forget the kneeling, she didn't even think the song should be played. She said she meant no disrespect, but that is so hypocritical. That is like saying, your mom is fat and ugly. No disrespect or anything. You can't use that as a cover. To say that the national anthem shouldn't even be played is insulting. What if we were to say, well, a WNBA game ought not to be played because it lacks interest from the public? No disrespect or anything. To not play the anthem is to remove the sentiment of respect and reverence that it is intended to establish, to remind us of why we are able to play these sports or attend these sports. There's a certain amount of unfettered freedom associated with that. Back in 2020, Griner pointed to the fact that in 1931, when the anthem was first introduced as a pregame event, that black Americans didn't have certain rights. That is certainly true, but within time, those rights were codified. America fought an entire civil war and was one of the first modern nations to abolish slavery. Griner spent almost 300 days in Russian prison for possessing hashish oil, which is illegal, while traveling in Russia to play basketball. In December, she came back to the U.S. as part of a prisoner swap for the so-called Merchant of Death, Victor Bout. So in terms of sports trades, getting back a WNBA star for a guy who killed a ton of people seems like a horrible trade because it is. But that's Biden's negotiating power. Griner suited up for her first preseason game with the Phoenix Mercury recently, and at her press conference, she said this.
Anthem, it definitely hit different. It's like when we go for the Olympics, you're sitting there, you're about to get gold put on your neck, and the flag's going up and the anthem's going. It just hits different. But being here right now today, it definitely hits different.
This is quite a turnaround for Griner. And I think, although I can't say for certain, that she may better understand why our country is exceptional and why we should all be grateful. She said in a previous press conference just a few weeks ago that she would not play internationally again unless it was to represent Team USA in the Olympics, which seems to denote a certain amount of newfound appreciation and pride in her country. This is an important change of heart for the 6'9" center. She went from an athlete who didn't even come on the court when the anthem was played to saying the anthem shouldn't be played at all, to to now standing on the court and saying she'll never leave the U.S. again unless it's to play for the USA. I imagine that 300 days in Russian prison will do that. Even if you feel that her prison sentence was harsh by the Russians, you have to admit that Russia's actions, draconian for sure, were part of a broader distinction between our two nations. Russian athletes who play in the United States are usually hockey players, and from what I can tell, they rarely get in trouble with the law. The only time they've made headlines this year is when some players set out of Gay Pride Night warm-ups because of either religious reasons or fear that the Russian government might retaliate against them when they return to Russia. Those players caught flack for that, but none of what they did was illegal in the USA. Sadly, most illegal acts come from our football and basketball players who think that they are invincible. But even the Russian hockey players don't make martyrs of themselves. They keep relatively quiet, probably just grateful to be making millions by playing in our country. The American athletes, on the other hand, are the loudest, often taking our freedom and even the freedom of speech for granted. That's because none of them have found themselves in a Russian prison cell. Anyone who did time in a foreign prison would likely have a very different perspective on what America represents. I've been saying this for a long time now. Athletes, with all their money and their privilege, have no comprehension of what it's like to live in or play in other countries. See, LeBron James is totally shut-mouthed about China and its abuses because, number one, he gets paid by them. But also, the NBA is shut-mouthed about it. He doesn't want to bite a mouth that feeds him. The NBA has been perhaps the worst league when it comes to calling out human rights abuses abroad because they want their money. Even in tennis, when Peng Shuai disappeared and seemed to reappear to make a forced statement, the only athletic league that seemed to have any courage was the Women's Tennis Association, who put their money where their mouth was and canceled tournaments in China. But when Novak Djokovic couldn't play in various international tournaments because he didn't want the COVID jab, the U.S. Tennis Association did not stand up for his rights. As I said, no NBA player will dare speak out against China, but they are happy to speak out against the very country that affords them the right to play, pray, and cash in on it. When NBA player Dwight Howard referred to Taiwan as a country, Chinese social media went for his jugular. Actor and WWE star John Cena made a similar mistake and made a monster apology because he didn't want the Chinese censors to boot his movie. In both cases, it all comes down to profit. You can't criticize China, but you can certainly criticize America. The difference is freedom. I think it's nice that Griner has perhaps seen the error of her previous views on the national anthem, but for many people, saying that it hits different seems like a tepid way of coming around. After all, we got Griner back, a complainer. Russia got back the merchant of death. That's what it took to make this trade. If I were Brittney Griner, I'd be trying to find a way to sing the national anthem at the next Phoenix Mercury game or paying a visit to Fort McHenry. See, I think what happens in professional sports, and this is of course true in entertainment as well, is a notion of bandwagoning. It becomes cliquish. It's also a way to virtue signal. Look how great I am because I stand up for something. But if that stand ignores basic history or forgoes the current liberties and opportunities one has, then that stand just seems hollow. If there's anyone that probably felt like he should sit out of the anthem or kneel, was Jesse Owens, who stood up to and ran all over Hitler and his German athletes. Yet there he was, standing on the podium with a gold medal on, but had to come back to a country that did not afford him equal rights. He couldn't even enter the front doors of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel after his victory. And ironically, he told a crowd of black Republicans at a rally that it wasn't Hitler who snubbed him. It was his own president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt never invited him to the White House to honor him. When you see that iconic photo of Owens saluting the flag while his fellow runners give the Heil Hitler salute, it puts things into perspective. This guy had to go up the freight elevator of the Waldorf after winning when he got back to New York. If that's not worth complaining about, I don't know what is. But he still stood and saluted his flag because none of those Nazi athletes could speak out against Hitler. Keep watching at epochtv.com/The Beau Show.